Thank you very much. It's an honor and really a thrill to be here. And thank you, Scott, for that kind introduction and correct pronunciation of my name. I'm very impressed as an Italian. Are there any other Italians in here? Great. The rest of you can leave. No, you can stay. Speaking of Italian, I'm reminded as I give this talk, in some ways, it's kind of strange that someone like me should give this talk, because I actually grew up in a house with no books. My family were immigrants, very smart, hardworking people, Italian immigrants. And yet, they didn't really have education. They had a grade school education. And so whenever I would be sitting reading, my mom would come up behind me and say in her Calabrian dialect, "Giuse, that's sul libro, te va male alla testa." Joe, put that book down, it's going to give you a headache. So reading in my house, brought on migraines. That was the theory. I listened to my parents in almost everything except really for that. The great thing about my family, they kept you humble. I'm one of 6 kids. And when I got my first job after graduate school, I said to my mom, I got a teaching job. I was a visiting professor at Penn, the University of Pennsylvania. And I said, Mom, finally, I got a job all'Università della Pennsylvania. I even said it in Italian. It was founded by Beniamino Franklin, founded by Ben Franklin. I said, sai chi è? Do you know who Ben Franklin is, Ma? And she said, lasciami ire, figlia. Non so nemmeno che cosa ho fatto per colazione. Leave me alone, my son. I don't even know what I had for breakfast this morning. That's how impressed she was that I taught at Ben Franklin's University. But, so it seemed very natural and organic in a way for me to become a professor, because they didn't have a great, there wasn't a lot of books in our house, but there were a lot of stories. I grew up with a storytelling culture. Maybe many of you have as well, these great stories about my grandfather on my mom's side, who had come to America as a grave digger, served in World War I and enabled my mom to get citizenship. And she came alone to the United States without the family, without her 4 children in Italy, and established the family. And my dad, who had worked 2 jobs, getting up at 3:30 in the morning, working 16-hour days. These were the stories I grew up with. And so when it came time to choose a career, it seemed real and organic to pick something that combined both stories and my love for Italy and love for their culture. So I became a professor of literature and also Italian studies. So I never really questioned the path that made so much sense. And then something happened exactly really 12 years ago in November 2007 that changed everything. Changed everything for me personally, but made me ask this question about literature, how it can change your life, what the impact is. And so I went to teach a class at Bard College, where I'm a professor. The morning started out like any other class day. And I walked into a 10 a.m. class. I was joking with my students, and I saw a security guard at the door. And my immediate thought was, I've done nothing wrong, so I'm joking. I said, look, they're coming to arrest me. And I'm laughing, and I noticed that the security guard wasn't laughing. And he said, "Are you Joseph Luzzi?" And I said, "Yes." And I knew in an instant something terrible had happened. So I raced out of the building, past the vice president of the college, running up the stairs to get me. A van was waiting, and I heard the words which would change my life. "Joe, your wife's had a terrible accident." And my wife, Katherine, at the time, had just had a fatal car accident. And so I'd left the house that morning at 8:30. By noon, I was a widower, but also something else. Katherine was 8.5 months pregnant. Oh, no. And she delivered the child. Emergency cesarian. And the baby was healthy and made it 45 minutes before she died. So in one morning, everything changed. And this talk's not about me. It's not about, this great tragedy that I went through in the road to recovery, but something happened that was really unexpected. As part of the road back, I turned to something that had really been part of my professional life. I turned to a book that I had spent years studying, Dante's Divine Comedy. Dante wrote 700 years ago. Couldn't be more remote, right, from us. And yet, For the first time, even after studying him for decades, I heard his voice the way I never heard before. I heard him describe exile. Dante spent the last 20 years of his life in exile, roaming essentially, the medieval version of castle surfing, from one castle to the next, looking for work, always on the run. And I learned from Dante these words: in a dark wood. In the middle of our life's journey, I found myself in a dark wood. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. I felt that I was in the dark wood, Dante's dark wood. This book resonated with me, this universal space of human suffering. And what did Dante teach me? I used to think it was what lands you in the dark wood is what defines you. But in truth, I came to see that it's what you do to get out of the dark wood that defines you. And I also learned something else. Dante wrote his great work after his exile, the Divine Comedy. He was rumored to have even perhaps contemplated suicide. We don't know. We do know that he was absolutely devastated by the loss of his hometown. And I felt that. I felt the loss of my own former life, and I wanted my life back. And Dante taught me you can't get it back. You have to rebuild a new one. So my journey with this book became part of my journey back to the living. And it made me ask a question that I want to ask you today. What is it about literature? What is it about great writing? These books that stand the test of time, that can change our lives. Why? Why did I turn, of all people, to a poet who wrote 700 years before I did? And what can you do in your own lives to make literature, great writing, great books, a part of your own everyday life? That's the mystery that I want to explore to you today. And what I'd like to do is, as almost my scientific, I'm not a scientist, but I'm a literary scholar, so I want to give you my take as a scholar, as someone who spent his life studying and reading, what it means to be, what these books do. I want to tell you 5 things that I think are the magic of these books, okay? The first one is this idea of alternate worlds, okay? I love F. Scott Fitzgerald's hair. You got to love the part down the middle, this old 1920s hairstyle. But F. Scott Fitzgerald, who's read The Great Gatsby? Many of you have. I love it. It's a classic. It's accessible. The story of Jay Gatsby, the bootlegger who's in love with Daisy and tries to win the girl, and eventually, by the end of the book, loses his life. It's an extraordinary story. Why do I bring it up and this passport to alternate worlds that I think great literature gives us? Because I want to tell you, I grew up in a working class family, an immigrant family. We couldn't travel. We didn't have money, but my town had a library. And in books, you can go anywhere. I remember reading about Renaissance France by this French author, Rabelais. I couldn't travel to the real France, but through this writer, I could go to France, and I could go back in time. Literature brings you all throughout the universe, and it connects you to worlds that happen even before you. When I think of The Great Gatsby, I think of scenes like these parties that Jay would throw at West Egg. In East Egg, in the West Egg area, where he would have these mansions, and he had gotten everything in life materially he could ever hope for. And yet, the way Fitzgerald describes it, he says, women were putting their heads on men's shoulders in a puppyish way, but no singing quartet formed around Gatsby. When I read passages like that, I'm back in America of the 1920s. I'm in this alternate world. I'm in a world, more importantly, of Jay Gatsby, the man who got everything he wanted materially. And as a friend once said to me, don't wish for something too much, you just might get it. Right? He got it, and he realized his American dream wasn't what it was cut up to be. As I tell my students, literature is like this fossil of people who lived in a different time, like an imprint of a fern in a rock. Literature gives you the way people thought and felt. A history book can tell you about the 20s in America, but can it recreate the atmosphere like The Great Gatsby. Do you see what I mean? This idea of creating an alternate world that literature can do, which leads to number two, right? If literature can create alternate worlds, right, it can also bring us into the area where fiction almost becomes fact or truth. This is a painting by another nice Italian boy like Dante, Raphael, the School of Athens, right? And you see Plato, the great philosopher, pointing up into the heavens. Plato's saying, truth is up in the heavens. Everything we see in real life is a simulacra. Beauty, justice, humans can never know that. We're too imperfect. We live in the land of the cave, the shadows on the wall. We have to use philosophy to try and arrive at some sort of notion of extraterrestrial truth. But on his left, you see Aristotle pointing down to earth, the Greek philosopher, saying, no, Plato, we only know what we see on earth. I think of Aristotle as a patron saint of literature, because literature tells us what we see on earth, describes it. It knows we're imperfect. We don't have access to perfect truths. So Aristotle wrote, history tells us what happened. It gives us the specific, the contingent, the one-off event. Literature, poetry, epic, gives us the universal. It gives us the could've, the should've. It extrapolates from the particular into the universal. So, as I tell my students, literature is the opposite of fake news. Fake news pretends it's true and tries to manipulate you into believing it. Literature is imaginative, tells you that it is, and then leads you to the truth in this way that Aristotle described. Think of Hamlet by Shakespeare, one of his most famous plays. Hamlet sees a ghost. Who's going to believe a ghost? Maybe he had too much to eat the night before. Right? Maybe it was indigestion, and his dad says, Hamlet, you must avenge my death. Hamlet he wants proof, right? Where does he get his proof? Do you remember the scene when he has Claudius stage? He has a play performed for Claudius, the mousetrap, and the murder of the king. Claudius, who had killed Hamlet's father, his uncle, Claudius is his uncle, sees the play and runs off. The play's the thing in which I'll catch the conscience of the king, right? That's an imaginative situation that leads to the truth. And that's what literature does. When I read of Dante's exile, sure, it's autobiographical, but it's a poem. Who knows if everything happened the way Dante exactly described it? But it was so real, it was so truthful that I could imagine myself into it. In a way, it's the opposite. Literature teaches you to ask the right questions. It won't provide all the answers. And books that do provide all the answers aren't being honest, because there's some things that there's no answer to. There's no rule book for getting over the death of a spouse or raising a child on your own, okay? The third thing I want to talk about is universal connections that come with literature. We live beautifully in an age of multiculturalism. We celebrate ethnic identity, and this is all great. I'm 100% behind this. I also think we should think about the things that connect us as people. What do all people share, right? This is a painting by Botticelli of St. Augustine, who lived over 1,600 years ago. He wrote the Confessions in 398 AD. If you went back to 398 AD, that would be like landing on Mars, right? The average life expectancy was in the 30s. Literacy was so low. I think they had only dial-up internet. No, just kidding. So you're talking about a totally different world. And yet Augustine wrote the memoir that is still the template for today, his Confessions. Augustine was addicted to the life of the flesh. You could almost say he was addicted to sex a little bit, right? He was addicted to glory. He could almost say he was a workaholic. These are very familiar patterns, right? I mean, Keith Richards ain't got nothing on Augustine for his autobiography. So this model for an autobiography, you can trace back 1,600 years, and it's still relevant. I find that miraculous. I'm reminded of that scene in L.A. Story where Steve Martin says, see that building over there? It's over 20 years old. Wow. This book is 1,600 years old, and it still makes sense. It speaks to something that's universal in us. After the death of my wife, I needed to know that I wasn't alone. Other people had been through it. And I found that universal connection. The fourth thing, I think, is reading is a ritual. This is Machiavelli, a not-so-nice Italian boy, right? You know, he wrote The Prince. He wrote this book about political brinksmanship and gamesmanship. Sure, we know that. But he also loved literature. And when he was exiled from Florence, he would describe reading like 4 hours a day, he says, I put on my best clothes and I go into a study where I'm lovingly received by ancient men in their, it's that ritual of reading. Something happens when we read. If I gave you a book right now, some of you are carrying them, it's just symbolic notations on a page. I always tell my students, you're the co-author. You bring the book to life. Each writer needs a reader. Reading is that ritual where something profound happens, where it can literally change your life. And the last thing I'll say is the power of stories. What is it about stories? Yuval Harari, in his book *Sapiens*, which some of you may have read, says that that's really what distinguishes us from a lot of other creatures, our ability to tell stories, to bring people together through narrative. The power of narrative. We are a storytelling species. I think it's just as important as the opposable thumb. It's what's made us what we are. Think of Shakespeare, the story of Othello, the famous story of Othello. He's an outsider in Venetian society. He's, considered old. He's probably in his 40s. It wasn't the new 20 back then, right? And he's married the most eligible woman in Venice, Desdemona, right? She'd have her own show, Bachelorette, right? And people are accusing Othello of bewitching her. And you know what Othello says? He says, her father oft invited me, basically, to tell my life story. To hear these things would Desdemona seriously incline. She felt compassion for them, and I did love her for it. Desdemona falls in love with Othello because he's a storyteller. And Shakespeare destroys all the prejudice surrounding Othello through the power of story. Once you hear someone's story, you can never think of them as a category or a group. You have to see them as a human being. For that reason, we need stories more than ever today in our society, our divided society. How can you make these 5 riches of literature your own? I think it's easy or practicable. I've created what I call the rule of 4s, okay? And I always think of my father when I do this, because my father was not a reader, but boy, could he use language. He would say things like, Mala nova tuo venire, may a new harm befall you, or, these crazy, poetic, King Lear-like curses, te vo sciupare la faccia nucon, and may a dog rip your face off, He was a real poet in his own way. So he wasn't a reader. How do you become readers? Very simple, my rule of 4s. Think of it like working out or walking or getting good night's sleep. 4 days a week, 45 minutes a day. 4 different books. 1, your favorite kind of book. Let it be romance, Harry Potter, whatever, anything, gardening, whatever. Your second category, contemporary writers. Who are the writers today, the fiction writers, changing the conversation? The third group, nonfiction. Doesn't have to be make-believe to be literature. And the fourth group, let one of those categories be a classic. Your Wordsworths, your Nietzsche's, your Virginia Woolf's, your W.B. Du Bois's. That mix of 4 will bring you the greatest glories of reading. And it will bring you to what my favorite writer, Dante, called that thing that connects all readers. Long study and great love. I want to close with an image. As I raised my daughter after those years, it was very hard. I needed a lot of help from my family after my wife's death. What really brought us together more than anything, I look back, is when we started reading together. And I went through all of Harry Potter with this girl. And I felt by the end, in that space of long study and great love, we were becoming a family again. Thank you so much. Thank you.